Good evening. This is Sean Lindersmith, and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of my podcast. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about who I am, where I come from, why I think it's a good idea to have a podcast, and also what I'd like to accomplish by reaching out and talking to members of the United States rugby community. So sit back, and I hope you enjoy the first show. A little bit about me. Everyone in the rugby community calls me Snacks. I got my start in rugby as a player. I started playing in the year 2000 in Honolulu, Hawaii for a team called the Chiefs. Then I played a little bit for the Hawaii Harlequins. Back then, you used to send in a check to USA Rugby to get your CIPP membership. And I remember getting my first CIPP card in the mail while I was on a deployment. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm playing this new sport. This is kind of interesting. They send me a card. Little did I know that card would ultimately transform my life over the next couple years. As I left Hawaii in 2002, started looking for a club in San Diego, California, and I started playing a little bit of touch with the old Aztecs. And then I started playing Coast Guard Rugby at about the same time. So Coast Guard Rugby is a representative team for the armed forces competitions. And so through the summer of 2002, I was playing with the old Aztecs for touch and getting ready to play the season. And then 2002 Armed Forces tournament, I made the All Armed Forces team. And with that came a selection to play in the National All-Star Championships, or what we used to call the old interterritorial tournaments. And through some conversations with some mentors of mine on the Coast Guard team and some friends of mine on the old Aztecs, I ultimately got the blessing, being a young enough player, that I could try to play at the highest level for a couple years and see how that goes. And I ultimately transferred over to the old Mission Beach Athletic Club, or OMBAC, and played with them from 2002 to 2008. Throughout that time, I continued to play Coast Guard Rugby in the fall at the Armed Forces tournament, and then represent OMBAC throughout the season. In 2007, I actually played. I didn't do so well in the Armed Forces tournament, so I ended up trying out for the Southern California Griffins, and I played in the last National All-Star Championship tournament for men's 15s that we had with the Griffins, and we took second that year, losing to Pat Coast in the final. It was pretty cool being coached by Dan Payne back in the day. But once 2008 hit, I had surgery on my knee. It wasn't anything major, but I just had some time to think that, maybe I was burning myself out. I was burning the candle at both ends, trying to play at the top level. Through OMBAC, I got to play D2, D1, a little bit of sevens to try to get better at the game. And then ultimately I got some time on the Super League, which back then was the highest level that you could play domestically. So I decided in the beginning of 2009 that I was just going to take some time off and just step away from rugby, because I was frustrated. I was doing 2-a-days trying to make the Eagles, and I never really materialized. Looking back, I was burning myself out, and I was ultimately selling myself short because I was working too hard, and I was never really fully fit for all the games that we were playing, and I didn't really know how to train as best I could. A lot of the practices and mobility work and strength and conditioning just weren't quite there at the time for me, or I was just not young enough and mature enough to take all of it on board. So I decided to quit rugby in 2009, and I was stepping away. I was going to go play kickball and live out my career in the United States Coast Guard and retire at 20 years in. And two things happened after I stepped away from the game. One was my best friend, Kenny, and his wife, Ronnie, decided to move back, or they got a 1-year tour assignment in San Diego after having been away for a couple years. And they were coming back, and Kenny asked me if we could play together on the old Aztecs one more time while he was in town, because we'd always wanted to play together. We'd always played Coast Guard Rugby together, but he was at old Aztecs and I was at OMBAC. So in 2009, he was coming back, and it was sort of the stars were aligning. And I told him, hey man, I'm frustrated with the sport. I'm not quite sure if that's the level I want to play at. I just don't know right now. And then the second thing that happened in order for me to change my mind was I got a call from Richie Walker, who is a coach that I really respect, and as a player, he was awesome. He was really, really good scrum half and always schooled me at touch. And so I had a lot of respect for Richie. And Richie said, talk to me why I wasn't playing and asked me some questions. And then ultimately said, like, look, why don't you give rugby another shot? Come over to the old Aztecs, because he was going to be the coach. And that was enough for me to start thinking. And in the conversation, the process of that conversation, he said, you really can't say no, Snacks, because I've made you the captain. And up until that point, I hadn't really been the captain of a team before, and it was really going to be a test of my leadership. And also with my best friend coming back, I agreed. I said, yeah, I'm going to come out and play. 2009 is also a pivotal year because I had done my first year as a liaison officer with the All Black Sevens in 2008, and I got invited back in 2009 again around the same time. So I was seeing what rugby looked like off of the field in terms of managing and coaching, and what strength and conditioning coaches do and what physios do, and sort of what events look like. And then, through that first season with the old Aztecs, I did another year, I did the event with the All Black Sevens. And then I played a really good year with the old Aztecs as the captain. And I learned a lot about myself and a lot about sort of leading by example. And I learned a lot about the game from Richie and Jared Fall, who's now, congratulations to Jared. He just won another national championship with the San Diego Surfers tonight at the WPL finals. But, I played with Jared, coached by Richie. My best friend was there, and I was just riding a high. And after that 2009 season, I got a call that a couple friends were coaching, and one was in the women's collegiate game, and they asked me to come be the forwards coach for that. And I accepted. And then the other one was just come have a look at this boys high school program that had just started through the young Aztecs at a local high school, where all the coaches just happened to be backs and they needed a little bit of help with the forwards work. So I decided to take on being a forwards coach at the college and sort of start to find my way through that. And in the process of coming out to the boys high school team, the teacher coach, Coach Dent, he noticed that I sort of connected with the team, and I'd already known the coaches, which was Karen Fong and Pierre Chamazan. Like, I knew them already, so I had a working relationship, and he asked me to come back. So in 2009, I decided to play full time, forwards coach on one team, and then started being a forwards coach of a high school boys team, right? So collegiate women, high school boys. And I just immersed myself into learning the game and learning how to instruct the game, and finding my philosophies and sort of the things that I wanted to be about as a coach. What did and the way I approached that was I looked at the game as, what did I want to learn when I was first a player that I didn't get immediately? Back in the day, you could say that there was a lot of fluff. There was a lot of drills and a lot of things were being taught to you, and you were told to be, props shouldn't be running, on the edges. Props, should just hit rucks all the time. And I was a good ball carrier, and I was a good tackler, and I could connect with people on the field. So I wanted to do those things. So I thought, let's teach that. Like, that's how I want to teach the game. I want to teach a wide, expansive game. And I found my coaching philosophies in 09. And I kept coaching 09, 10, 11, at Saints and at the UC San Diego women's team. And throughout that time, I also continued to be the liaison officer for the All Black Sevens. And they had moved from San Diego to Las Vegas, and Las Vegas had grown enough. And during my time at Las Vegas Sevens, another transitional year for me was 2011. My coaching was going really well, and I was doing really good. I had taken over the head coaching role at Saints, and it was my second season as a head coach there. And during the Las Vegas Sevens, an employee from USA Rugby noticed that I was navigating an international event quite well through the All Black Sevens. I was able to, sort of speak the event language and the terminology. I knew what team services was. I knew what operations was. I knew all these things out of the box. So my training to become a staff member, a regional staff member, might not have been as intensive as somebody else's. So they asked me to come on board as a regional staff member in late 2011. And so I got training. I can't remember if it was late 11 or early 2012, but I went to Boulder, the old office above the bank, the Chase Bank, and I got to see all the plaques and see where everybody worked. And sort of that office looks completely different now, obviously being in Lafayette and the turnover, but I got trained, and somebody I met that day was Jennifer Gray, who's now with Rugby America's North. And that was a pivotal moment, was meeting Jen Gray and sort of connecting with her and building a friendship and a professional relationship with her that continues to this day. And 2011, I started coaching, started eventing, or continued coaching, started eventing, continued playing. And my team, also that year, we made the Final Four. And so I won the first of two Final Four appearances in 2011, 2012 with the San Diego Old Aztecs after winning Southern California for a couple years. We took third in the nation both years. And then 2013, I had done a couple of events, high school championships. I'd done women's sevens early in 2013, the first one in Houston as team liaison officer manager after having been a liaison officer for those years up until that point. And so I was really proud to do that event. And then my sort of last hurrah in my playing career was I was an exchange player for the Old Aztecs to go down to New Zealand and play for the Mid-Northern Rugby Football Club down in Whangarei, New Zealand. And ended up winning, earning my way into playing with the Preems, or the Premiership side, Premier side, and we won a grand final, and I got to play in Tull Stadium, although I did get a red card 6 minutes into the second half. And that was something if we hadn't won that final, I was getting on a plane the next morning out of New Zealand and never showing my face again to any of my Kiwi friends. But ultimately we won that, and sort of I finished my playing, and then I immersed myself fully into coaching in the end of 2013. And I had gotten out of the military. I was full-time in the university and just working events and, moving right along and gaining more responsibility and getting more trust with my USA Rugby staff. And ultimately that led us to hosting the All Blacks in 2014 at Soldier Field. And it wasn't the first sellout we had, but it was like the third consecutive game where we had a sellout, 62,000 people at Soldier Field. And we were, myself and Matt Rosemeyer, Kelly Cavalier, Eric Guide, and Jen Gray, we were the operations team for that. And that was just, and James Wilbur was also just coming on board then as well. But it was like the biggest thing we've ever done in US Rugby. And I was able to be a part of that. And it was so special. And, although the US didn't win on the field, the United States rugby public in general won because we showed the world that we could host that level of an international event. And that was sort of the start of where we ended up earning the Rugby World Cup later on down in 2018. But that was the one event that everybody sort of took notice. And the day after waking up on the day after the All Blacks test match at Soldier Field, it was kind of like, well, what now? What are we going to do now? And ultimately I continued to work events, from that was in November 2014. And then in early 2015, I got a call from Tristan Lewis and said, hey mate, can you pick up a couple coaches for a forwards camp in Chula Vista? And I said, yeah, of course. Would it be okay if I watched the camp? And Tristan said, yeah, no, that'd be great. We'd love to have you around and you could check things out. And I said, okay, sweet. So I got the information of the French coaches that were coming over. And as I was on my way to pick them up, a player of mine from Saints sent me a message and said, hey, coach, you think you're bad? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about, Will. And he sent me a screenshot that I was listed as the assistant manager of the Eagles for this camp. And now that hadn't been discussed, and I had maybe not had earned it quite yet. But I went to the camp and talked to, Davey Williams, who was S&C at that time, and talked to Tristan and said, like, what does this mean something? And they said, well, if you could help with the camp, we'd love your help. And so I just helped. I just, carried bags, filled up water, took people to and from, and I listened and I didn't say much. I watched a lot and I continued to work hard. And that was in January of 2015, which is when we started preparations for the World Cup later that year. And at the end of that camp, Tristan said, hey mate, can you come to the next one in March? And that's when we were preparing to go play Argentina's select side, and I think Uruguay down in Salta. And so I got invited to that one, and then I got listed as the assistant manager from there. And then we did women's sevens again in Atlanta that year. And then, then the summer tests were coming up, and after that camp in the end of March, April timeframe, maybe even it was April, May, I can't remember, but that's when Tristan and Kelly Cavalier started talking, and they sort of brokered a deal that I would be an assistant manager for the Eagles throughout the week, and then come Friday morning, I would go and work the event on the event staff. So like I would manage from like Sunday till Friday morning, and then I would leave the team and get in onto the event staff, work the event, and then get back to assistant managing on Sunday morning with the team. And it was funny because the first, like, we had like a 4-week test window in that July, and like because it was World Cup preparation, so like the first 2 weeks I would go, and then all of a sudden I would disappear, and then on Sunday I would reappear, and the boys would be like, "Man, where do you go?" And I said, "Oh, I'm on the events team. I'm helping operate the event, like getting the other team in and out of the locker room and doing all that other stuff." So it was kind of a joke for a while that I would like disappear. And I wouldn't go, I wouldn't be there for the boys. But then they figured it out, and then finished the summer, playing in Sacramento, San Jose, and then we did World Cup preparations where we played in Chicago. We played Australia in Chicago, and then the team was leaving the next day, and then I didn't get to go immediately over to England for the 2015 World Cup. So, I said goodbye to the team that night, and then I ended up flying out 2 weeks later to the day of the South Africa test match, and then helped throughout the rest of the time over in England for the Japan test in Gloucester. And then, unfortunately the results weren't what we wanted at the World Cup, and the staff sort of went away, for lack of a better term. And I got a call to manage the Eagles in early 2016 as I was getting on a plane to go manage a Falcons tour, which I thought was going to be my swan song at USA Rugby as a manager. I was going to go down and do 2 weeks on the road with some up and coming Falcons players in the sevens pool, and just sort of lead them and get that done, and then come back and find a real job. And while I was getting on the plane, it was January 4th, 2016, I get the call from Mags, and he said, "Hey, John Mitchell would like you to be the manager." So I said yes to being the manager on January 4th, getting on a plane in San Diego to go to Houston and down to Argentina. And I realized I didn't bring my laptop with me. So I had to plan the whole ARC in 2016 with an iPhone 4 on spotty Wi-Fi in South America. And it's become sort of a folklore in the rugby world that you pull a Snacks when you pull a rabbit out of your hat by putting things together on the fly. That was one of the most interesting times. But then I managed the Eagles through 2016, came on board manager of the San Diego Tropics, aka the Breakers, in 2016 as well. So I pulled double duty there, continued to work events, and then I took another break at the end of 2016 because I just flamed out. I had burned the candle at both ends for so long, and pro rugby was awesome, ultimately what it was in terms of problems and negativity, and I just had had enough. So I took a break, watched my kid play touch rugby in the first iteration of Girls Rugby Inc. in San Diego, which was really cool. And I figured, development might be a cool window to do. And so after that, in early 2017, I accepted a contract for Minnesota Youth Rugby, and I worked for Minnesota Youth Rugby and events and liaison officer for the All Black Sevens from 2017 up until August of this year in 2018, right after the Rugby World Cup. And so now I'm just working event contracts and going around the country and working wherever I'm needed and looking for the next thing. It was at the last event that I worked where we decided maybe doing a podcast might be a good idea. And that came about after some conversations with a couple of my colleagues from USA Rugby while working in the tournament office. One day I was working with Alicia Allen from the youth department, and we were talking about India National Development Summit and sort of what it looks like to present there or be on a panel. And we were talking about how the panels are great and the presentations are really great, and it would be really cool if we can sort of get folks some action items to take directly from um, NDS back to their organizations and put them into play really quick. And I thought that was a really interesting concept because I've always taken a lot away from National Development Summit, right? Whether it was at the panels or forums or the networking or the development school that I always signed up for after, right? High Performance Friday or the development school on later Sunday and Monday. And so I basically was telling Alicia, like, oh, I'd love to present at NDS. I just don't know if I have anything to say that people would listen to or, anything to take away. And so throughout the week, started thinking about that more. And I was working with my other colleague, Logan Gregory from the events team in the tournament office. And after a couple days, like we were just like messing around talking about, oh, it'd be fun to have a podcast and just like have these cool little conversations that we have at events, but, maybe tape them on a digital format. Obviously, we don't use tape anymore, but and then that could be a way to disseminate some more information or maybe give some tidbits or action items to the greater public at large. And so we played around with some funny ideas like the xylophone from Greece at Rydell High School, or then we kind of had a good laugh about that. We did a poll on Facebook just for fun because we were in the tournament office and we were bored. And it turns out like out of 50 some odd votes, 45-ish votes were in favor of doing a podcast, where I already have a blog, which is kind of an outlet for me to deal with stress. But so I'll keep writing, but podcasting was something that started coming on my mind. And then through the poll, I got to chat with the head coach of the University of Michigan men's program, Brandon Sparks, who's set up his own podcast recently. I believe he started in July. It's called Between the Headsets on betweentheheadsets.com. And he said it was a really good professional development opportunity for him and sort of a learning process. And I really enjoy learning as a lifelong learner. And I thought, okay, I'll look more into this. So I started looking at equipment and, what it takes and best practices and hosting platforms. And I'm not quite up to speed yet on everything because I'm not as technologically savvy as everybody else. So after the conversation with Sparks and listening to a couple of his podcasts, I kind of thought, yeah, maybe it was a good idea. And I thought my premise or my platform might be rugby development, sort of conversations about taking away best practices from other areas of the country, which information sharing is huge, right? Like if we can work together and if something's working, say in Rugby, New Jersey, it definitely could probably work in, Southern California Youth Rugby or Southern California Rugby Football Union. So it was a matter of how to get that information from one area to another. And I just happened to be traveling across the country and talking to people. And it really solidified when I was at the women's sevens in Glendale, and there was a break in the games, and I was sitting having just a quick break with Karen Fong Donahue, the owner and founder of RuggersEdge.com, Scott Harlan, who's a regional development manager for Rugby Americas North, and Nick Racono, who's a sevens referee manager for USA Rugby. We were just sitting around a table, just happened to have all worked together for a long time. I actually played with Nick, played with Karen's husband, Troy Donahue, back at OnBack. And we just were sitting there chatting and going back and forth about things that were happening in our areas. And just from this conversation that was about 10 minutes long, I must have took away 5 or 6 things that I would feel were valuable to anybody in the rugby public. Karen's RuggersEdge.com has got some awesome stuff. She just did a post about coaches recruiting athletes and sort of how that communication process should look in terms of a best practice through email and through social media, right? Like you always, and I won't spoil it, but you should check it out because it's really good information and sort of a best practice to put in straight away. Nick was telling me about some stuff they were having referee wise in Southern California, and Scott was talking about his time in the Caribbean and sort of what his job looks like and where he'd like to go. And I just sat back in awe of these 3 guys and gals that I've worked with for a long time going, man, maybe there is something to this. So that leads me to what I want to accomplish with this. Like, I want to bring some more information to the public in general. If there's a best practice that we get from maybe a show I tape with somebody in Chicago next week that helps somebody in New Mexico or Texas, like, so be it. Like, I want to sit down with people, hear what they're doing, hear a little bit about them and their areas, and ultimately just see if any sort of information or best practices come out of that, and you kind of always find these little bit of encouragement or nudges along the way. And I was listening to a podcast today with Joe Rogan, and he was interviewing a guy named Jesse Itzler, who was involved with Coconut Water, and he had wrote some theme songs for some NBA basketball teams and stuff. And he was talking about how he had run a 100-mile race and met David Goggins, who's a notoriously tough athlete and Navy SEAL. And he had met him at this race, and then they had this lunch date. And then he ultimately ended up asking David to come live with him for 30 days just to sort of do a reset and kind of give him a check of where he was at in his life. And he said throughout that whole process, there was all these little nuggets, right? Like, and he would have never been in a position to have those nuggets if he hadn't put himself in that, taken a risk and putting himself in that situation with David. And he ultimately ended up getting enough nuggets that he wrote a book in 2015. And I just ordered that today, and I'll somehow get the name of that book in either the Facebook post or whatever. But this is nuggets. These are little gems that we could take from somebody in the rugby community that I get an opportunity to talk to, that somebody somewhere else in the country may hear by chance and be able to put that into best practices. That stuff happens all the time, and it's valuable, and I want to put that out there. So I want to accomplish getting the nuggets out into the world. I want to keep learning myself. I want to hear new ideas and what people are doing. I get excited about other people's successes more than sort of the things that I get to do. So learning and growing is really important to me. And I'll do that through connecting with the community, whether at an event or over Hangouts or Skype or however this materializes. I just want to connect with the community and the colleagues and friends that I've made through my travels. And I want to show their personalities and show their successes so other people can use those as well. And that's lastly, like, share the ideas. I just want people to share and share alike and see if it works for them. You might take 10 things out of a conversation I have with somebody, or you might take one. As long as you take one thing away, if you learn or enjoy what we put out, I'm happy with that. And then it helps me in my learning and growth process as well. So with that, I thought I'd talk about two things tonight in terms of takeaways or maybe learning. I don't have a guest here. Obviously, it's just me. But the first is something I realized while I was on the Premiership scholarship trip back in March. I met all these great coaches from throughout the country and some of the athletes, the young athletes that we have. Emily Heinrich was on that. She's getting her first cap next week in Chicago, which will be really cool to see, having been a scholar and watched her sort of grow on that trip too. But so these conversations were happening organically outside of the training environment we were in. And I noticed that when we all talked about our regions or our areas, and myself included, that we would talk about something positive and like something we wished we could do. And then we would immediately follow it up with like either the person talking about it or somebody who was listening would say, but the real problem is, and they would name why we couldn't do it. And so it had happened enough, and we had built such a good enough rapport with each other that I noticed, and I was actually talking to, I believe it's Pat Maroney from Rugby, New Jersey, and Christian Brothers Academy, the Colts. And I said, Pat, we say this. I think I'm going to change this. And ultimately I changed it from any time that I wanted to say, but the real problem is, I changed it to the thing that's affecting me, right? The thing that was affecting me ended up downplaying the situation a little bit and made it not as negative. And it seemed as if I was able to overcome them with just a little bit of work or research or finding another way around it. And it's given me a more positive outlook on initiatives or practices or things I want to put into play. I used to get so defeated, just like a lot of you out there, right? Like, hey, I want to get a field with lights. Well, the real problem is we don't have money, right? Well, instead of saying the real problem is the things that's affecting us is we don't have the money right now. So why don't we do a fundraiser? And then all of a sudden that fundraiser seems much more achievable. So the first thing for me is maybe change our language a little bit. Let's talk more positively. And yeah, it might be a little kumbaya for some of you, but I'll tell you what, it works. It really works. I've tried some things have worked, some things haven't. And it all came from just being able to take a risk from saying, this is affecting me and this is how I'm going to overcome it, right? Problems seem insurmountable. Things that are affecting me are just little issues that we can mitigate. So that's one of the things. I'd love any feedback on that. If any of you have experienced that yourselves, I'd love to hear about it. Comments, messages, emails, whatever. And the second thing is how to get a rugby job. This is something I'm coming across more of these days as our community grows and as our sport grows. How do you get into working into rugby? The easy answer is you volunteer. You start off as a volunteer. You volunteer as a coach, you volunteer as an administrator, you volunteer as a board member, as a committee member, right? And you take ownership of your little area and you become good at that. You become a subject matter expert, say on, coaching forwards or how to manage a team. And then you do that long enough, someone will notice. Someone will take a notice to you and maybe give you an opportunity, right? And then once you're given an opportunity, you've got to be in a position to take it. For every job that I've earned in the last 7 years of doing this, there's a couple that I had to say no to, right? It wasn't in the right time frame, or I was still in the military, or I had a coaching obligation that I had to do. So sometimes things have to line up, right? And the other part of that is if you see an opportunity and you might think it's just outside of your capabilities or your qualifications, don't be afraid to apply, right? We just had a liaison officers for the women's sevens in Glendale, and I found some real good diamonds in the rough. Like, these folks were probably the best group of people I've worked with. Now, every liaison officer has had their moments to shine for me, but this group in particular, they understood what it meant to come on board and do a good job and help make a team's week in the country successful. And they all got that opportunity because, one, they either answered the phone when I called, they emailed me, or when I put out posts on social media, someone recommended them, or they were tagged in it, or they reached out. They had the confidence and the courage to say, hey, Snacks, tell me more about this job. And through that process, I gave them enough information that they felt it was appropriate to apply. We had one young lady, Joanna Rohr, who at first thought it was a paid job. I'm sorry, Joanna, I don't mean to pick on you, and then I was really excited about having her on board, and her contracts might not have lined up. So we went back and forth for, a little bit of time, and ultimately her contracts shifted a little bit and she was able to come on board, and she was one of the best liaison officers, to be honest. And I learned some really cool stuff about Boulder touch rugby that hopefully I can talk with her about later on. But, she made it work and she came on board. She had a great experience from everything that I can see, and her team won. The Black Ferns ended up winning. Unfortunately, Eagles fell short in the final, but it was a great tournament. The Eagles played well, Black Ferns played well, Australia played kind of okay, which is cool. We beat them for the first time ever. But Joanna would have never had that experience if she hadn't taken the time to reach out, answer the phone call, apply, talk to her work, and make it worth her while. And I think if you talk to Joanna now, she would say that week she spent with Glendale and with myself and the other liaison officers was worth the time and effort that she put into it. So getting a rugby job, get really good at something in the sport, take the time to become a subject matter expert, apply for things that come up, reach out to people, figure out what you want to do, and then go from there. I'm looking for people all the time. I'm looking for the next Snacks. That's the thing that myself and some colleagues were talking about at Women's Sevens is I'm not going to be in a position to work these events as often as I have in the recent past, and we're going to need another Snacks. Now, through our liaison officers and other volunteers that have taken the courage to step up, we've found a couple people who we think will progress and track into those positions. And the reason they're there, the reason they're getting it is because they took the time and the effort to apply, to get better, to learn, and to have fun with it, you know? Um, so I'll leave you with that, right? No more, I don't say, but the real problem is anymore. I say the things that are affecting me. And if you want a rugby job, take the time and effort to learn about it, learn about your roles, get better at your roles, and apply for things. That's the best way. I'll leave you with that tonight. This is a really rough podcast for my first one. I know that. Don't even have a name for it. You can find me on Instagram at Snackattack, SNACKATTK. Also on Twitter at the same name. My name is Sean Lindersmith on Facebook. I'd love to hear what you think of this.